Doyle. I'm the Electronic Services Librarian here at the University District of Columbia. And I want to welcome you to the first in our spring season of Jazz Forums. And we have a real special event tonight. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss the collection that William Gottlieb created and to learn about him from Larry Applebaum, who is the music specialist at the Library of Congress, where the collection resides, and to also speak with Delia Gottlieb and Steve Gottlieb. And I guess if you want to come up and have a seat.
Oh, Delia, please, please. I can't do it without you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Encourage her, please. Yes. Oh, Delia. Okay, I suppose, shall we begin?
You're on.
Okay. And I suppose the most appropriate way to start is to ask you to say cheese. Smile. Thank you. Okay, let us begin. On February 16th, 1995, the Library of Congress acquired the William B. Gottlieb collection. This is an extraordinary collection of primarily jazz photographs shot between 1938, when Bill began working for the Washington Post, and continuing for a decade into 1948, when he was shooting primarily in New York City. It's more than 1,600 images. They've all been scanned. They are now all up on the library's website, and in fact, I believe you can see the opening page of that online exhibit. What the library did in scanning is we created high-resolution TIFF files for preservation. And then we've created lower-resolution derivative files, or JPEG files. They are compressed. And those were always the ones available and accessible on the website. If you wanted access to the TIFF file, that is the higher quality, high-resolution files, you always needed to get permission, written permission, from the Gottlieb estate. They were the executors of the estate. And the amazing thing that has happened this week is that yesterday, as of yesterday, no more permissions are required. The entire collection is now available and accessible for use, commercial or otherwise. And this is done through extreme generosity. First through the vision of Bill Gottlieb, but also the generosity of the family and the estate. It is a great gift, not only to the United States, but to the world. So we thank you for that. Let me just give you a very, very brief overview. I mean, on the website, you'll see there is a biography, there's an essay about his work, there are audio clips of interviews with Bill Gottlieb. But I'll just say that he was born, and please correct me if I make a mistake. He was born in 1917 in Brooklyn, New York. Grows up in New Jersey. Bill Gottlieb attended Lehigh University, and I guess that's where he caught the jazz bug. And so now I think it's sort of appropriate for me to turn to Delia and ask, how and when did you first meet Bill? First, the circumstances.
First, I'll tell you how he got the jazz bug.
Okay, go ahead.
He contracted trichinosis. It took a while for them to diagnose it because he got it at a Jewish fraternity house. And it was right at the end of school. So he came home, started running a temperature of 104 or 5, and nobody could understand what was wrong, and so forth and so on, until somebody else from the fraternity was sick, and they found out, and then finally some doctor said, it's trichinosis, you live or you die, there's no medication, so just stay in bed, and hopefully you'll survive. And he had a very close friend from high school rather strange, who went to American University. When he came to the university, he took his grandmother with him to keep house for him. And his name was Doc Bartle. And he subscribed to every European jazz magazine. And while Bill was flat in bed the whole summer, he came over every day and played jazz to him. Because Bill didn't know anything about jazz until that time. So I always credit Doc Bartle for having gotten him all kept up about it, so that when he went back to college for his senior year, he immediately started a record column so he could get free records and so forth and so on. And when he graduated and got a job on the Washington Post, he went to the Sunday editor. And he said, why don't you have a column on jazz? No other paper has it. That would be something different. The editor said, oh, well, maybe so. You might even get $5 extra a week. I think he made $30 a week then. So a couple of weeks later, Bill went to him and he said, they got a couple of letters that came in, not an overwhelming number, but people noticed it. And then he went and he said, but you know, if there was a photograph, it would catch more attention and so forth. So he sent a photographer from the press room out with him. And he took a picture, so forth, and the editor called him back in, and he said, hey kid, forget it. It's time and a half for overtime. I didn't realize that, so that's out. So Bill went to the store in Washington and bought a 3 1/4, 4 1/4 speed graphic, which is what the press people use. And he walked into the press room and he said, okay, show me how to use this. And that was how the thing started. So he took all his own pictures. As soon as they showed him how to use it, he started to use it.
So you were about to tell us how you two met.
Oh, well, we met on the Delaware River. I was in one canoe and he was in another canoe.
That's so romantic.
And it was romantic.
Yeah.
And so when he told the story, he'd always say that we met, you know, we were in 2 canoes. And he asked me if he had heard that there was a girl. He was a counselor at a camp right near where my father had a house in the country. So, and I was up there with a friend, and he was alone. He had gone paddled up to Bushkill to buy candy or something, you know. But he had run through all the girls and the counselors at the camp already. You see. It was August 3rd. So he said, I hear you go to Scouts. One of you goes to Scouts, and I said, me. And then he said, and then we were married. Wasn't quite that fast, although I had 1 more year of school. So I graduated June 13th, and June 28th I was 20, and July 2nd I was married. So we did get married quite soon after.
Now,
by the way, a poignant footnote to that is, well, my mom's dad had a house on the river, so we spent a lot of time there. But when my dad died, he instructed us to take his ashes after he was cremated and sprinkle them in the river where they met.
And that's where I'm going. Well, I'm 90 now, so.
it is obvious why Bill was attracted to you. So tell us what attracted you to him.
Oh, I just fell in love. You've heard of that, haven't you? That was it. Yeah. Well, he courted me because my father was, you know, a lot of my father and friends and everybody came to this old house. It had no plumbing. We carried water from a well and so on. There was an outside shower, and we had running water in the kitchen sink. But it was pretty primitive. A lot of rocking chairs on the front porch, and he would come down every night after he put the kids in his bunk to bed, and he would play records for me. Now I had never heard jazz, never, and so that was kind of interesting. But sometimes he would be late, and I would be waiting there. And I always remember my father had an Italian friend, and he sat on the porch. He was walking along. He said, "You got a lemon. You got a lemon." But yeah, so we saw each other all summer, and 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 he saved all my letters. And we sold our house. The house was sold this end of June when I turned 90. And lo and behold, we had so much stuff that we didn't have a chance to look at. But now I'm looking at letters that he saved that I wrote to him in 1938. So I guess it was a mutual affair. And
We have been late to some get-togethers. That wouldn't surprise me. My dad was an extremely single-minded person.
right.
When he set his mind to getting something, not a whole lot ever could stand in his way. So I think once he decided on Mom, there's no ambiguity, no questions.
No.
That's going to happen.
Undeterred.
Undeterred.
Celia mentioned the speed graphic camera. Now, Steve, I know you're also a photographer.
Yep.
Explain for our audience what that camera really is and what's the challenge of using it.
Yeah, I'm going to talk at the end. I wanted to show a few pictures and explain. I thought you might be interested, at least for a brief moment, in my showing some pictures and explaining what made them so special, speaking as a photographer, not as somebody who loves jazz, not as a son, just as a fellow professional.
Well, as a matter of fact, I have to tell you that my husband thought, after Stephen started, Steve's a lawyer, but he didn't like
Was,
law
right.
particularly. Anyhow, so he became a photographer. And Bill always said to me, he's really better than I am. And he was pretty proud of his own work, but Stephen's was, excuse me, better.
I used to find out because she would call me after he told her. He whispered to me.
So
What's true?
Bill really wasn't shooting at all until he wanted to illustrate his articles.
That's right. He took some, you know what? He did. He took photographs on our honeymoon up in Lake Winnipesaukee. My father had a Kodak camera that came out like this. One of those. And he took pictures of me back then. But that was it.
And you said somebody showed him how to use the camera?
The press guys at the Post.
And did he develop his own work?
Yes, he did. And, Mom lived through all of that. He taught me how to use a darkroom when I was 12, and I certainly appreciated that. And I got to see him, kind of doing his thing, but it had been years before, since, when he was introducing me to the darkroom, there was a gap of many years since he had last, printed a jazz photo. But I wanted to follow up on your question about the speed graphic and the quote lesson from the press guy. One of the things as you see some of his work that you need to understand is that the cameras, they not only didn't have program mode or autofocus, this didn't even have focus. You had to set, it was kind of a little range thing, that you would set, and you'd go, oh, and he was great at this. You'd go 21 feet. And I saw him do this when I was a kid, and we were doing some photography things together, not with that camera, but he was great at estimating distance. So you'd have to estimate distance, and you would have to estimate exposure, because if it's ambient light, that's one thing. If it's flash, you had to know what distance the flash is, and so on. And there wasn't, this huge amount of latitude. You had to really nail it. So this idea that he went to some press guy who explained it, this is like months and months and months of incredibly hard work, because the camera was extremely, not only crude, but in a sense it was very complicated.
It's complicated. You only could take two
You could only
pictures
take
at
two
one
pictures.
time.
If you screwed up, you would accidentally expose one of the pictures, because you had, kind of Ansel Adams-ish with the dark slide.
You put a
So you could turn around and, flip the picture
had to be
around
in
and
a
expose
black
another
place
piece of
and then
film.
and then put another plate in.
And then the processing was complicated. Everything about this camera was complicated. And so that is just one part of some other things I want to say later about just how unbelievable it is that he produced, for that matter, any decent exposures, much less phenomenal pictures. And his work is compared now to the other great portrait photographers and certainly jazz portraitists who, like me, have had, not only did we not have to deal with flash bulbs, you know, it's flash, it's easy to take off your camera, you don't have to wire the flash one to the other. Well, in the old days, you had to actually physically have a wire going from the camera to the first flash to the second flash, so everything got synchronized. And it was a cumbersome camera, kind of heavy to carry, and so on and so on and so on. So his work compares to everyone else's, and yet they were able to, you know, other photographers to take unlimited pictures, you know, do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 rolls of film, no problem. Flash,
What that
bang,
came later.
you know, bang, bang, bang. So it just makes it that much more astonishing to me.
Did you accompany him on any of his shoots?
Oh, yeah.
Do you have any stories you'd like to share about?
I held the umbrella because it was raining when we took the shot of 52nd Street.
This, do you know this image? This is an iconic image, one of the very few of the most important street in New York in the post-war years.
It was called the Jazz Street. There were a lot of
52nd
clubs
Street.
on the street. And he took a shot from the side.
I have it on my little thing.
Yeah, but you know, the street is wet and the cars from 1943 are lined up. And there are some posters about who was playing in what club. And you can see some club names too. And he did it in color. And then had it printed also black and white. Incidentally, he stopped being able to use a darkroom about 4 years after he started doing prints himself. Our son Edward, who lives up in Ithaca, has vintage prints in some boxes because those are prints that Bill made himself. After that, he got something called metol poisoning. His fingers got all swollen up, and the doctor said, don't even touch it. The chemicals that have done it. So eventually the swelling went down, but he had to
Yeah,
stop.
if you glance back there, you
Yeah.
get a quick view of the 52nd Street
That's
picture.
52nd Street.
You could count at least 6 or 8 nightclubs in just a portion of that one street.
Yeah, I want to be there. I want to be there inside that image.
Some man who had a big showroom out on Long Island came to Bill, and he said, I want that 52nd Street shot, and he gave the dimensions, and the dimensions were about the size of that opening there with the red velvet curtains. And Bill said, wow, that's pretty big. He said, yeah, that's what I want in my showroom. And he said, well, it's going to cost you a lot of money. He said, I didn't ask how much it was. That's what I want. And he had it, and it attracted a great deal. He's never sorry that he had it. But I don't even know what happened to it. But we had a pretty big blow-up of that in color in our house. What size would you say the one that had?
40, at least 40 by 60 inches.
Yeah, it was big. It was like this dark area there, yeah.
So let's go back, if you don't mind. I want to sort of flesh out some of that history. When he's in his early 20s, he's here in Washington, D.C., he's sort of Mr. Jazz here in
Yes,
Washington.
he is, and we go out every night.
Yeah.
Well, the first good thing that happened, the wonderful thing that happened, was that I had seen an article in Vogue, and it said that the Turkish ambassador in Washington had 2 sons who were very interested in jazz. And there was a picture of the 2 of them next to a piano. In the Vogue article, it was a full-page picture. And I brought it home, and I showed it to Bill, and I said, now, I bet they'd be a good item, you know, for your column. And he thought about it, and he said, yeah, not bad, I'll think about it. I said, fine. The next night, the phone rang, and it was Ahmed. And he said, we've been reading that column, we'd like to meet you. So Bill said, well, come on up. We lived on 13th, he had an apartment on 13th Street that he had taken before we got married. That's where we were living originally. But
13th and what?
off Georgia Avenue. And there was a grocery store. I know it's when I walked from Georgia Avenue to the, it's an apartment house, don't remember the number. But anyhow, so the boys came over and we met them. Well, it turned out that Nestle liked to play tennis, and Bill liked to play tennis, and they were both pretty good. And they liked to play table tennis, and we liked to play table tennis. P.S. We became very, very close friends. And everything we did together, except going to the nightclubs. They liked hanging around, but every Saturday night, either we went to the embassy, or they came to our house, or there was a couple. He was a doctor, and she was a social worker. Their names were Williston in Washington, and they had built a beautiful big house off 13th Street. 4-story house, private house. They had no children, just the two of them. And we went there. They had a big record collection up and a room up there. They were wonderful, and that was our group. And the boys had a cousin, Sadi Koilan, who lived with them too at the embassy. They were up on the 3rd floor, and they had these wonderful line drawings that somebody had done, and Nestle brought them back from Paris on the walls of this room. And then they had their records, and everybody bought records from Slapsy Maxy. And
Waxy.
Huh?
You said
And I
that?
think his nickname was Slapsy, right?
Oh, I thought the store was Waxy.
Yeah.
yeah,
As in- as in
but his
record.
name, everybody called him Slapsy Maxy. And the boys cornered him one day. And by the way, Ahmed always invited him to things, you know, when he was, like 10, 15 years ago, when he had some big presentation or something. He never forgot him. He always invited him, and Maxie always came. But way back then, Ahmed would say, because he was the one who loved looking, I mean, they both did, but Ahmed was 15 when I met him. And he said to Maxie, he said, why do you let Bill come in? When you get a big batch of stuff, you let him come in first, and that's really not fair. Maxie said, not fair. You guys spend 4 or 5 hours and buy one record. He comes in and he buys a half a dozen records, and he takes only a half an hour of my time. Don't get away with you.
For a second. Most of you probably wouldn't know the name Ahmed Erdogan. I won't, well, okay, we got a show of hands.
Got it
There'll be a
right
handful.
now.
Okay.
Giant.
This guy, yes, you know, this 15-year-old grew up to be one of the giants, not only of jazz music, but even more in rock and roll. I mean, he was one of the major players at Warner Records and Warner Communication.
Well,
And his
They
older,
bought the company.
his brother Nestle was a major jazz producer at Atlantic Records. Ahmed owned, you know, the two of them, I guess, owned Atlantic Records. But then he went on to, you know, Rolling
Right.
Stones and so on and so
Oh,
on.
yeah.
And to put in one sentence how significant this guy was in the music business, New Yorker runs these monster profiles, you know, it takes forever to get through. Ahmed, they needed 2 issues to cover his life. Okay, that's the level that the 15-year-old grew up to. You know, he was one of the real major
He was a big player.
worldwide
He
players.
was a big
in the
player.
music industry.
And Nestle, you know, came in with him later on and did the albums and spent a lot of time in Europe mostly. He recorded in Europe.
They say Ahmed was a charming man. Was he charming at 15?
Yes, he was. And he told me years later, and he was a really close friend, you know, we all spent so much time together. And when he came, well, anyhow, he said years later, he said to me, I was so shocked when you came to the door when we first came to your apartment that you were wearing something that looked like, I don't know what it was, but it looked like underwear to me. It was hot as hell. You know, it was July, and I had this beautiful, I thought gorgeous silk, you know, cotton with daisy buttonholes that I had in my trousseau. I mean, and here I am entertaining. Anyway, but we were very good friends, and it turned out that Nestle and Ahmed, that Nestle and Bill were much closer in age. See, Ahmed was the young one. Nestle was, when we met him, was about 22, and Bill was like 23 or 4 then. And they played a lot, but Nestle came up to about here on me. And, but they were both totally charming. When they had no money, they ordered shoes from London, alligator shoes, you know. They were to the manner born. They had lived that way. The embassy cooked when we came, did everything I liked. And it was quite a life we had.
The same embassy
Well,
that they have now on the Circle.
No, now they have that one, but they have another new embassy.
But that's where you used to hang out.
Yeah, but we hung out at the embassy, we hung out at our house, we hung out at Tom Willison's.
Now, I'm very curious about this era of Washington, especially the jazz scene in Washington. You mentioned going to the Turkish embassy, you were hanging out at your home. But where would you go to hear live music?
Well, Tom knew these nightclubs that were outside of the district, you know,
Outside
Maryland,
downtown?
the Stockade, one was called the Stockade. There were a lot of nightclubs where the New York musicians would come down and play. But, you know, Washington was a totally segregated city in 1939, 1940, whenever. I mean, totally. So once we were at one of the nightclubs and they were throwing stones, kids were throwing stones at us. But there were a number of nightclubs. There were also, because Tom had the Elegant House, and he knew a lot of the artists personally, if any named black artists came to Washington, they stayed at his home. There wasn't a decent hotel.
Weren't there performances at the Howard Theater?
Yes, the Howard had a big stage show that changed every week. And Bill arranged the very first mixed band show ever. You've read about that. I mean, he had Bob Crosby, who had a band playing in Washington at that time, and Basie was at the Howard. And as Bill said, the Howard owed him, because he did a lot with the manager of the Howard. And it gave a lot of publicity, and took pictures of different artists that were appearing there. And so he went to Bob Crosby and he said, how would you like to have a jam session with Basie? He said, it's okay with him, they're at the Howard Theater. And Bob Crosby, who had a Southern band, they were all Southerners, said, absolutely yes, for Basie, we're on. And they went, and Bill took pictures. We were up until 4 o'clock in the morning. And he took pictures of the mixed group there. And those were the first pictures, as far as I know, of accredited, bands that had names. So.
Yeah, that's the Basie band with Lester Young in it, and Lester shows up in one of the photographs.
That's right.
It's
Oh, well,
It's
Lester.
Bing Crosby's brother.
Huh?
Bob was Bing Crosby's
was
brother.
Bing Crosby's brother.
Now, you mentioned that Washington was a segregated city.
Oh, totally.
Totally. How about socially among musicians?
Among the musicians, well, that's what I said. Musicians are different. They didn't bother themselves.
But were there places where
No,
black and white could hang together?
No.
In public?
no. Except, as I say, a couple of the nightclubs that I remember being in. But other people didn't want us there at one point, you know.
I remember my dad telling me that in the 30s and into part of the 40s, the black and white musicians would, jam together and so on. We're
Right.
very comfortable. He said when people started to become very conscious of the segregation and, became like a subject to talk about and think about and worry about, that he felt that there was starting to be a little bit of a separation because people were starting to, just be self-conscious about the fact that they enjoyed being together.
There were also two different musicians' unions here in Washington. There was a white union and a black union.
Really?
I think until the early 1960s. So Washington, in many respects, was and perhaps still is a southern city.
Oh, it was. It was a southern city. Hot as hell, too. The only place that was air conditioned in 1939 were the 2 theaters and the 4 department stores. Nothing else was air conditioned.
Well, this is just an aside, and I think this is true. My dad always claimed that when he went to the Washington Post to get a job, he was Phi Beta Kappa at school, editor of the school, yearbook, et cetera, he had great credentials. He claims that he took a job with the advertising department because that was the department that had air conditioning. He didn't like the heat of most offices. And that, that kind of makes sense to me. Knowing him and, and knowing the Washington summers.
I can tell you that I took a job in the department store because of the air conditioning. I know that, for sure. Because, my father was involved with the Department of Labor, and he said, oh, I'll get you an introduction to Francis Perkins, who was then the head of the Department of Labor. I said, please, I don't want anything. I had worked at Macy's the summer before on their training squad. I said, I'm going to a department store. And talk about segregation, I had an appointment at Julius Garfinkel's, was the name of the store. It was the fancy store in Washington, 39. And I went up to the department, the whatever. And I go into, because I had an appointment, and I'm there on time, and I go in, I'm all dressed properly. I had to wait a couple of weeks because it was so hot that I sweated so much, I was ashamed. But I had the appointment, I go in, and I handed her all my credentials from Macy's. She looks, and I was on training squad, and they gave me good letters and all that. She said, fine, we'll start you probably in the training department too, and then you can go and start on the floor. And she said, but you'll have to fill out a form when you come out, so go to my secretary's desk, and she'll give you the form. So I take the form and I fill it out, and it says religion. I say Jewish. And the secretary glances over it before I'm leaving, and she said, oh, I think you should wait a minute. Just a moment. And she takes the thing and goes into her boss, and I have to go back into the boss. And the boss said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. I really did want to hire you, but I can't. You're Jewish. Sorry. Thank
This
you.
is at Garfinkel's,
Garfinkel.
of all places.
Of all places. And I was pretty shocked. But I said thank you, and I walked out, and I went over to the Landsbergs. I didn't have an appointment or anything. I went up to the department. I said I'd like to see the, personnel. I can't think of the name of whoever hires you.
Personnel.
The personnel. So I was looking for that.
Supervisor.
So I went up to personnel, and I got interviewed, and I got hired.
Did you
I
check
made
Mormon
20
on the box?
Right there, and then they didn't have a form to fill out. And I got $20 a week, and I started in the men's department downstairs, and I can tell you the names of the people I worked with. And I loved it, and I was there for 8 months, and then they moved me to the training department, and I was there for about 8 months. And then I was an assistant buyer in the women's department a while, I don't know how long, and the next thing was they made me the buyer of children's clothes. And I loved it, and I was successful, and I made money, and my merchandise man called me and he said, you bought 100 dozen pinafores. I think that's ridiculous. I said, it's Easter, and I will buy back any pinafore that's left on the rack after Easter. And he laughed like hell. And you know what? I didn't have to buy any of them. They were so delicious, and they were $3.95. Anybody who had a kid, you look at this pinafore, and if you didn't have money for a new dress, you bought a pinafore and put it over the old dress. I mean, it was just delicious.
You can't resist.
I loved working. I loved going to work. And I came up to New York to buy every 2 weeks. I took the Congressional. At 3 o'clock, you left work, or 2:30, left work, and got on the Congressional. And it was a 3.5-hour trip to New York back then, just like it is now. But they had a dining car, and the dining car had beautiful white linen, and they had waiters, and it was so elegant, and they had a wonderful salad and a silver bowl with a salad dressing. Oh, it was heavenly. And then you did it on the way back down to Congressional too.
Sounds very civilized.
Very civilized.
Um,
And I worked until my daughter was born in 1943. And I worked until I was about 7.5 months pregnant.
Anyway, yes.
I was 7.5 months pregnant. Or 8, no, I was closer to, well, no, 7.5, and I was very big. And she wasn't born until October 8th, but she was the biggest baby that was born at Flower Fifth Avenue Hospital that year. She was 10 pounds and 9 ounces. So there.
That's awesome.
And Dad undoubtedly didn't like her crying, so that enabled him to stay even later at the Jazz nightclub.
Oh, no, he wasn't even there. He was in the Army by then.
Okay. Well, anyway, getting back to the Jazz.
Right.
Yeah, and let's turn also back to the photography. Can we talk a little bit about his, I mean, maybe you'll deal with this later, but his style, his composition, what
Yeah,
separates...
let me deal with that a little bit later when we actually are projecting images,
Okay.
because without the images, the
Okay.
words don't resonate.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe I could just ask then, if you look at the 1,600 images on the website, the vast majority are in black and white.
Yeah.
When would he choose to use color and why?
I never talked to him about it, but color in the early days when he was shooting was such a slow, what we now call ISO, it used to be called ASA, in terms of light sensitivity, that indoors, even with flash, was very, very difficult to do. Because there just simply wasn't enough light. You would almost need like an outdoor setting. And I think Ektachrome came in, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in the late 40s. So it would only have been the very end of his jazz career, if you
Right.
could call it that, which ended around 48-ish or late 48, that he used it, and he used it very, very limited. Now, it might have been that the 52nd Street picture might have been done earlier, because that could be, you could have a tripod and you can take a 1-hour exposure if you need to. But you can't do colored indoors until Ektachrome comes in. Photochrome was just not usable.
Yep.
What I never asked him, and I always wanted to ask him, is the Ektachrome image of Frank Sinatra somehow got preserved, so that in his book it's in black and white, but the original's in color. It's just fantastic. And most Ektachrome slides would fade after
Right.
10 or 15 years.
Kodak didn't.
I threw every single thing out when I went through his files of the old Ektachromes. They were just unsalvageable.
Right.
Not even with the greatest Photoshop. I mean, I suppose you would know more about this, but some restorer might be able to bring something back. So I did throw out any rare, like talking about pictures of me and crap like that.
Talk maybe a little bit about his approach to lighting, when he uses natural light versus artificial light, and how these are tools.
That's why he was a genius.
Tell us why.
Because he could analyze and decide on angles. He knew the music. He only took 2 or 3 pictures at a time. But he made everything count. I mean, I would hold a light out here. He analyzed and took, and he used late as whenever, I don't know when Polaroid came in. Much
Yeah,
later.
I don't think he had
But-
a benefit.
No, he didn't have, well, later on, but I guess, film strips were sort of Polaroid. But he was just absolutely perfect at setting a stand up here and a stand there, and knowing that he was going to have, this musician was going to be over there and he was going to take his shot just like that. He planned everything up here all the time.
How much would you say is, and maybe the answer varies depending on the example, but how many of these images are contrived in any way, in terms of lighting or posing, And how many did you just show up and document what has already happened?
I would
Well,
say.
for me, that's like reverse engineering. You know, it's not like I asked him, you know, which of these pictures did you do this or that or the other.
But you have a
they're
sense
very
from
easy.
looking.
They're very easy to reverse engineer how he did it. Now, just so you understand, I run a photo workshop among other things, and I teach a course in flash photography. And the reason people struggle with that class more than any other class is they can't visualize what they can't see right in front of them. And if you're shooting flash, that's exactly what you've got to do, because the flash is not mimicking the stage light or the sunlight. And the other complexity is people who are performing are moving. So a musician, you know, a shot with this, when a musician is facing like this, is dramatically different than if he turns his head like this. In terms of whether the ear gets hit, whether, you know, whether the dark eye gets a little bit of light because of where the flash is located. And it's extremely difficult unless you've done it a lot and you have a certain kind of intensity, you know, a certain kind of focus to what you're doing, to know when you set up the flash there and the performer is here, you not only have to have the exposure right in terms of understanding the distance and so forth, but you've got to understand that he's got to be in a certain position. And so, you know, the flash are not as powerful, you know, as we have now. So the flash is somewhere where the musician has got to have been very conscious of his being there. Plus, you know, it's not the point and shoot, you know, the speed graphic, and even the Rolleiflex, which he graduated to, is a pretty substantial camera. So they had to know that, you know, that it was happening. And it's kind of a big deal. And, you know, you have to have a light stand holding the flash usually. And what made it even more astonishing, as my mom mentioned, he only got to take a limited number of pictures. Well, why is that? Well, one thing is dealing with that sheet film is extremely slow and cumbersome. Another is film is expensive, flash bulbs are expensive. He's getting, you know, whatever, $10 a column, give or take. I mean, you know,
He's
certainly
getting
in the
$5.
30s.
I don't even think they ever raised them up to 10.
So if you take like 7 pictures, you have now eaten up your entire profit. Plus, he didn't view this, the photographs, as the principal thing he was doing. He was there to write, to listen to the music and write articles. And this was almost kind of an
Like a
afterthought.
hobby.
Well, I'm going to illustrate it, yeah, like a super serious hobby. So here's this kind of almost like hobbyist who's mastered the flash and is able to understand how the musicians move. And also
that was
have
the
their
other
trust.
trick about it. Well, and yeah,
Have their trust.
They
So-
all liked him
So
because
he could get up close. And I will show a couple of pictures for those of you who have any interest in either, you know, how the impossible gets done or interested in photography. He was one of the first people in photography who would consistently, when it was needed, use a second flash. Very complicated to do it. You know, when I do my flash workshop, I save it for the last hour and a half because I know most people are going to fuzz out. And even though they can see it on an LCD, you know, but he didn't have LCDs, God knows he didn't have Polaroids, all visualized in the head. And generally, when you use a second flash, it is to create a hair light or a shoulder light or both. And what that does is most of these pictures were taken in a nightclub environment. Background is kind of dark, the lighting is kind of moody and dark, and if you use...
and there's a lot of smoke.
Yeah, a lot of smoke. Yeah, the first nightclub I went to was to hear Jerry Mulligan when I was a kid, and every 15 minutes I had to go outside the Village Vanguard and like, it was terrible.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah. At any rate, to create a hair light, you have to hardwire from your main light to a second light. You got to run the wire around the floor. You know, excuse me, Duke, I got to, you know, you got to get up on the stage and set that thing up and know exactly how it's going to hit the hair and the shoulder without like hitting the face too much. Not easy to do, and then you got to know how far to put it away because flash has one power. Now, what I do with my hair light, oh, it's too bright. I see it on an LCD, dial it down. Well, flash, you don't dial down. You got to move the damn thing. So this is all extremely complicated to do. But the reason you had to do it so often is, I'll show you a picture of Frank Sinatra. He has kind of darkish hair. The background is dark. If you don't use a hair light, the hair disappears. A dark suit disappears against the background. The hair light puts a glow and a little glow, and it also adds a certain kind of visual power. And I am like a nut about classic movies. I have never seen a close-up of a woman, and very few of men in the 30s and 40s that don't use a hair light for the close-up. It's kind of got that little bit of godlike glow that you get. So, you know, the lighting guys know how to do it, but it's not easy. And imagine if you're just taking 2-3 exposures, and then you're getting the results you got. It just, excuse me, I'm carrying on a little. It blows me away. How the hell he could pull it off consistently every time.
I'm assuming that he's shot in the same places regularly. I mean, there are many shots from the Three Deuces, for example, or Benghazi here.
Yeah, but they're all kind of similar. You know, you have a certain kind of dark texture, usually dark textured background,
Right.
which is going to disappear when, you know, with the kind of lighting he used. So wherever the nightclub is, you know, it's all
And
familiar
then
terrain.
a lot of pictures, for example, Willie the Lion. He shot Willie in his own apartment, sitting at his own piano. Took a shot of him there. Took shots of. I mean, we went all over a lot of different places.
Well, then there were some rehearsal pictures too. You know,
Yeah, this is
guys,
what I
guys
want.
were just jamming. My
Yeah.
favorite picture is a famous, back then, a famous drummer, and he's practicing on a drum pad.
Dave Tough.
Yeah, and he's up against a cinder block wall.
Yeah.
So my dad knows we don't need a hair light now, because you can see his incredible hair. I don't think what actually he looks like, but anyway, it was kind of this electrified butch haircut that he had, and you could see the hair against the background because it was a gray cinder block. If it had been a dark background in the nightclub, he would have needed a second light.
It's a beautiful shot, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's taken in the basement of Eddie Condon's club.
That's right.
And one of the many things I love about it is that he doesn't glamorize Dave Tough. And this happens so often in Phil's photos, is that there's a kind of honesty there, where it's not a conscious,
Oh, no, it's-
iconic image. It's not an epic image. It's a real image. It's a real person.
He was practicing.
He was
Yeah,
practicing.
he was a magnificent drummer. He
Oh,
was
Dave
a
Tough.
wonderful drummer. But he always thought he could be better. And he walked downstairs
Yeah.
and was practicing when Bill took that shot. The very first show that Bill had of his jazz photographs was when his book came out in 1979. And there was a gallery on 57th Street, and he knew the woman who ran it was a neighbor of ours. And when she heard that the book was coming out, she said, "Oh, I'm going to give you a show in my gallery," which she did. A memorable show, I must say, except that the book didn't come out when it was supposed to. It was late. So there were no books there, but the pictures were there. And Whitney Valiant, who was the jazz critic for the New Yorker, came in, and he said to her, "How much is that picture?" And she said, $350. And he said, "I'll buy it, and I'd like it right now." And she looked at him, she didn't know who he was. And she said, "I'm terribly sorry, sir, you can't have it. This is the opening day of the show, and he's going to have to stay here. I'll be happy to have it delivered to you if you give me your address next month, you know." And he argued with her for a little bit. I was right there. And he finally said, "Okay, all right, I'll wait." Something, you know, like that. But she had hors d'oeuvres and there was wine. It was a real opening. And we had hordes of people that came. But I think she sold 2 other pictures that same day. And so
We'll look
she
at
was
that
very pleased.
We'll look at that picture in a bit. But one thing is my dad liked the honesty. And just envision one of the top drummers of the era practicing on a rubber pad, and the pad was propped up with like a Campbell's pork and bean can, and there was a big glass of wine there. Now, you know, nowadays, you know, with the kind of work I've done and, well, pretty much everybody else, you got to go through like a publicity agent. You know, they'll say, Dave, you say, Bill, we're going to clear away the pork and beans thing and the wine thing because, you know, this guy is in Duke Ellington's orchestra or something, and we don't do pictures like that. Back then?
Back then?
You could, and you did.
And you know, unfortunately, Dave Tuck, you know how he died? Falling down a flight of stairs. Because he was drunk.
You mentioned that musicians trusted him. Why do you think they did?
Because they saw his work. And they knew he was honest. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, so he couldn't be buddies with them, you know, let alone drugs or anything. I mean, he was, everybody said, he doesn't drink and he doesn't smoke. And he doesn't drink coffee even. Oh my God, what I said, yes, but he has a terrible temper.
So one other reason I think that he had that kind of access, and you know, he's photographing some of the most famous people in the world, and he's 6 feet away from them.
That's right.
Nobody else was doing what he was doing, to my knowledge, during
right.
that era. So now, you know, I mean, I did a little photojournalism for a while, and to me, the critical part of being a photojournalist was showing up and having sharp elbows, you know, because there's so many other guys and ladies surrounding you trying to get that angle that
But
you
there wasn't
want.
anybody doing what he was
Yeah,
doing.
he was doing it, and then he was giving them publicity, which
Exactly.
they all wanted.
So he led a fairly straight, he was a family man, and he led a fairly straight personal life.
Yes.
So did he get tired or weary
Yes, he did.
of hanging out in nightclubs till 4
Yes,
a.m.?
he did. And that's when he quit, and that's when we started an educational film strip.
Is that why he quit?
Yes,
Huh.
because he just got tired of coming home at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then we had children, you know.
Well, the year
He never had a job. Bill never had a job where he had to be someplace at 9 o'clock in the morning. He was not a morning person. And he saw to it that he really never had a job where he had to be someplace at a specific time. He was always his own boss in a certain way. So he had this column, I mean, he had control of it. When he was doing advertising for the Post, we went to the Boardman Park, we went to all the hotels where they had bands and interviewed them, and he had pictures of all those. They were wonderful. A lot of interesting. Xavier Cuba, you know, plays. I can't even think of all the names now. But
Well, when he got out of the jazz business, 48 or early 49, I'm not sure, probably better, but I was 2. Sister Barbara was 5, and then my folks brought into the family, due to some complex family circumstances, 2 other children. So now there are 4 little mouths to feed.
right.
And even though sometimes when he was doing the jazz work, he also had another job, you got to kind of go out and hustle,
Well,
and you got to get out of the jazz business.
No, he was an editor of Downbeat. Before he got out of the Army, Downbeat had got in touch with him. And they offered him a job as editor of Downbeat, which was, at that time, was the biggest jazz magazine that was being printed, published. And he took the job before he was discharged from the Army. He knew he had the job. And because we had 4 children, and he had to take the subway, because Downbeat job also, he wanted to take pictures. He was the editor and he wrote for it, but he also did covers for Downbeat. So, and he was never paid for any of those things. That's the important thing. The same thing at the Post. He wasn't, but yeah, he was paid for it, but that it was just a little extra time. It wasn't that they owned the pictures. They were not interested in them either. So that was it. And certainly when he was on Downbeat, he was paid for being an editor, not for taking pictures. And he did a lot of...
That's not going to be a particularly lucrative job, and you know,
No.
2 years old, food, you know.
Oh, yeah, well,
You need to make some money.
yeah, so, but there was an office right next door to the Downbeat office, which was in a building next to Radio City Music Hall, which has all been torn down now. And that office was run by a guy whose nickname was Porky, because he was quite heavy set. And he had a business called Curriculum Films. So he came to Bill one day, he saw somebody, he knew he was taking, he would come in and out of the downbeat office, and he saw that he was taking some pictures. And he said to him, you have plenty of time, I mean, you're out at night, but you could do I need somebody to shoot some film strips for me. And he told him what this particular set and thing was. And so Bill said, well, I'll try it. So he did some stuff for it, because he had time during the day. And as I said, he never had set hours or anything like that. And he really, just like he stopped going to nightclubs because he got tired of it, he was really tired of staying up late and doing that stuff. And this stuff was different subjects and really interested him. And that's when he quit Downbeat and went to work for Curriculum Films. He worked for them for about, 6 months to a year, I guess. And then we decided we would start our own company, which we did. And I heard the musicians that came to, but we opened a little place in Jamaica. We had a house in Queens, because it was right close to the best public school in Queens. And I had kids sent to public school, a lot of them. So we opened a place at 154th Street, I think on Jamaica Avenue. And it was a little, it was like 2 rooms, an office. We had a friend who loved jazz and hadn't been doing anything much because he got out of the Army reading and collecting $20 a week, which he could do for the Army after the Second World War. And I said to him, you know, Walter, Bill needs you, so he's going to come and work. We'll have to really start to work. So Walter worked with Bill. And Bill used to say, between the two of them, they would answer anybody's question about anything. Thermopylae. What year was Thermopylae? You know, that kind of thing. Anyhow, so, and then we opened, I was the bookkeeper and cleaner too, you know, clean. And that was it. So we started a film strip company there, and we got a contract from Encyclopedia Britannica, and we produced 55 sets, 6 film strips in a set. Every public school, every public high school, every public grammar school in the country used film strips.
How many
for a
people
period
here
of time.
remember film strips?
But,
Thank you.
good.
Yeah.
For those who don't, just think slide with a little caption. underneath.
Slides, and originally it didn't even have captions, but the slides with captions. Then you also started doing it with sound too. The machine, they had a machine that said with sound. But teachers liked them because they could stop any place and say, now what do you think about that? Or get kids going and talking about it. And it was a very good, it was very inexpensive teaching tool. We didn't make any money. I was literally borrowing money to pay Walter and whatever. We had to have outside artists after a while because everything wasn't in photography. We were doing a lot of art. We had wonderful artists because we could get a good artist for not much money because it was bulk. It was, you know, if they got a set of film strips to do, there was 25 shots in one, and there were six film strips. And if you pay them $25 for a watercolor, it's very little money, basically, for somebody who's a good illustrator of books and things. But you don't get jobs to do book illustrations every week. But once you have a set of film strips, you have work for 3 months. And
Let me just say one thing about that period, and I know you want to get back to the jazz period, but this is something you wouldn't know, and I find it very interesting, and I was talking to my sister Barbara about this just before we came over here. When I grew up and became conscious, the house was filled with music. Never jazz. Never in my recollection did I hear a jazz record growing up. It was, kind of Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, Vivaldi. No Ellington, Armstrong, or Gillespie. And I have
He did
this
play the
sense-
records in the
Maybe he did, but not when I was around, to my recollection. And I have a sense that what happened is he was so immersed in it that, he just got to that point, like I guess I got when I used to play Parcheesi, and on the 10,000th game I said, that's it. I am never playing Parcheesi again. And I don't think he really started listening again until the book came out. And he renewed his acquaintance, in effect, with his own pictures. So the only evidence I ever had that there was this whole phase of his life was in the television room. There was a wall of 78s, several thousand of them, all, of course, carefully cataloged, because he's a very methodical guy.
by me.
Okay. And so there was that, and then there was a book about yay big of 8 by 10 images of the jazz photos with a slightly animated and goofy Cab Calloway on the cover, which I remember looking at once or twice. But we never talked about that. We never talked about the records. And it wasn't until I was 7 or 8, give or take, that I got curious. What the hell is all this stuff that I never hear? And I started taking out some records. And I remember taking out a couple of records, and I put them on the turntable, put it to 78, and he came by, and I said, this is interesting. Imagine I'm 7, 8, maybe 9 years old. And he said, Coleman Hawkins. And I looked down, hey, that's Coleman Hawkins, and then I play something else.
Yeah.
Go, Lester Young.
Oh, he
And I'm thinking, wait a minute,
recognized
they
Eddie.
both play the same instrument. How'd you get that? It was like a complete bit of magic to me. But I remember him saying,
Yeah.
well, first of all, I heard a lot of those records before, so I know who's who. But, you'll know if you start listening.
But you know what?
You hear their styles.
See, you say you didn't hear the music, but we played records all the time when we had company. We had a lot of company all the time.
Could be.
And I used to show them off with that. I'd say, guess what? And ask him any of the musicians playing on the record, And
Yeah, so he was a whiz on that, of course. And my most vivid recollection of jazz in my childhood was I was rummaging through the records, and I came across a record, and as I recall it, it was Irving Fazzola and his All-Stars. Not exactly big name now. Have you heard that name? Okay, so Irving. Anyway, I started carrying this record around the house like a kid would carry a teddy bear. It was like such an endearing, important thing to me. I played it like 100 times, and then one day I put it down, and somehow I was doing some somersault on the couch, and I broke the Irving Fazzola, whatever it was, 1 Street Rag or 1st Street Stomp, and I was so embarrassed and worried that I never went back into the record collection again. And I threw away the broken record, and I never told them until it hit me when I was an adult that I had destroyed Irving Fazzola record. But anyway, so he
they're
moved
all
on.
they're all at the New York
Moved on.
Public Library in the.
Yeah.
I'll throw
At
that
any
in.
rate.
Let me ask, did Bill see his work as art? I mean, clearly
Yes.
it was a way to make a living, and it
No, he
illustrated
thought-
his
no,
columns, but
He knew he was good. He knew he was really good.
did you talk to him about that?
Yeah, if there are any therapists in the room, you can talk to me later. I need some help because we got some little father-son stuff going on here, and so we didn't talk a lot about photography.
Well, first of all, you have to know that my son and my husband were #1 in father-son tennis in the United States for 1 year, and for about 8 years in the East. They were all different divisions. So they talked a lot.
We spent a lot of time together, and I'll show you a couple of pictures he took of me when we get to the slideshow part. But my sense was, well, certainly anyone who spent 5 minutes with my dad knows that this is not a modest guy. But I never had a conversation with him about the music, to the extent it ever came up, until the book came out, where he said, I have this great body of work. I did these wonderful photos. It didn't come up. I don't think he viewed himself
I don't think so either.
as a serious photographer.
Until the book.
when the book came out, even then, you know, the story is he didn't have the idea for the book. It was some guy who was a neighbor and friend who owned
the
a Strand
bookstore.
bookstore. He said, "What do you ever do with those jazz photos?" He said, "Yeah, they're in the basement." You know? Well, Bill, you got nothing else to do. You're retired. Do something. Make yourself useful. Because all he would do would be all day when he had time on his hands is he was recording classical music on cassettes. And this was like his obsession. And then this guy said, you know, do this book. And he did the book. And I don't think he expected it to get the intensity of reaction from the jazz people and from the photo people. I mean, anyone who had photographed jazz musicians who saw this work, anyone who was a serious portrait photographer, when they saw it. And so I think he came to realize that the thing he became best known for, he was kind of humble about until it belatedly hit him.
We started with Smith Kramer when they
Yeah, but that was way after the book came out, and then he was getting exhibits. I'm talking about that period
It
from
wasn't way
49 to 79, 30 years.
Well, we were working hard.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, he never said,
Feel
hey,
well.
everybody, look at this album of 8x10s, you know, and let his ego kind of shine on that. No, never came up.
No, that's true.
Do you think his work influenced yours?
Everybody assumes, you know, I hear that when people see my stuff and then they find out that my dad was a photographer, the most common reaction is, oh, well, that explains it. And I'm thinking, well, actually, I don't know, you know, that kind of apple far from the tree thing. You know, I have a bunch of siblings. They didn't go into the photography business or into, you know, the writing business and so on. But and he didn't really teach me anything, and we didn't talk about photography, as I alluded to earlier. You know, I published a bunch of books. He would critique the book to my mother. She would call me and give me the critique. What can I say? You know, crazy stuff. And you know, and I would send annual reports or brochures I did, and you know, say, oh yeah, I got it, good. But what he instilled in me was a sense of dedication, of professionalism, of doing your best, that is so much more important than teaching me any techniques. So I just feel he's kind of implanted in my head, for sure.
Did he ever talk about other photographers? Did he express admiration for others?
Occasionally about another photographer who did jazz musicians, but he didn't keep up that much with what was going on in the photo world.
I think now would be a really good time for us to see some of your favorite images, and maybe you can explain what makes them so special and point out something about
I'll
this.
try.
Yeah. Do you have
I
a
just want to add one
pointer?
thing.
Yes.
He basically
No.
saw himself as a writer,
He
not a
was primarily
photographer.
a writer.
He was a writer
He was a writer.
first.
I think if you had asked him all through that period, you know, what do you do for a living? He'd
He
say,
said,
well,
"I'm
I
a
sell
writer."
advertising, or I'm a soldier, or I work for the Office of Price Administration, and in my spare time, I'm a writer, and then I I write about jazz and I do some illustrations.
So ironic then, that the thing he's best known for is the
Yeah.
thing that he thought that
He was much more invested in certain, trying to dispute science facts and disprove them, which he did and wrote a book on, and writing than he was in photography.
And our film strips, I mean, he did them a lot in photography, but we had, you know, 80% were art. But the photography ones, you know,
Sure, yeah, that's easy to
he
do.
shot as a, you know, as an educational. It was educational. It wasn't like
But it's
jazz
a very-
program. What?
It's kind of an ironic thing that, you know, he lived his life and had this incredible talent and produced this incredible body of work, but for most of his life, he didn't pay that much attention to it. And he didn't see the genius of it, which has hit me, you know, kind of like a ton of bricks. In fact, before getting into the story, into this very brief, it's a very, very brief slideshow, I'll tell you one story. There was only one moment in my career where my dad's jazz photography kind of intersected with my own work. And that was, I did a book called American Icons, and I gathered like the 100+ most iconic things about America, and one of them was jazz music. And I had the book completely finished, and was, you know, I'm sending stuff to the publisher and so on, and there's one picture I haven't done, and it's the picture of a jazz musician. I am like a little hung up on this because, you know, it's like that was his territory, and he had mastered it, and I somehow just didn't want to get into it. And so I resisted and resisted, and finally, you know, publication date is coming, so I got to get this picture done. So I know a guy who's a big band leader, and I asked to come to a rehearsal, and I come to this rehearsal, and I see a guy with the very unlikely name of Howard Johnson, no relation to the I guess now defunct Motor Inn, or whatever they called it. And I go up to old Howard, and I said, there was a break in the rehearsal, and I kneeled down, I remember, next to him, and I kind of looked up, he's a real big guy, playing a baritone sax, which is classically a jazz instrument. And I said, excuse me, I'm a photographer, and I'm doing a book about America, and I need a photograph of somebody who just really looks like a jazz musician and really plays a jazz instrument, and I would like it to be you. And he said, you any good as a photographer? I said, yeah, pretty good. And so help me, I had only known him now for like 5 seconds. He said, you as good as like Bill Gottlieb? That's only came out of nowhere. And I said, no, I'm not as good as he is, but for one thing I'm good, for another thing, that's my father. The guy looked at me with that, you know, so Jesus sent you? And he said, and all he said, he just looked at me and he just said, tell me where and when, just like that. And so that's how I got my last photo for the book. That gives you an idea of the reverence that people who know the music felt about him. And Howard Johnson came after this era. He was kind of a 50s, 60s, 70s guy into the 80s. So anyway, let me just run through a few pictures and share a few thoughts with you.
We can stay here if you want, or if you want.
Good to sit down.
Okay, so this is the picture that took two people. Bill with the camera, Delia with the umbrella. And I think it demonstrates a kind of patience that he had. You know, it's not like he was living on 52nd Street, waiting for the right night, going down, being set up. And this is really one of the true iconic pictures, and I just love it. And I'm assuming this is just an early Ektachrome that has faded very badly, so you're getting all these reds in the picture. Can we dim the lights just a little bit more? Hello. Now, how do I... There we go.
Yep.
Mr.
Okay, so when you talk about getting trust from the musicians, you know, he might have been the only guy doing it, but if he was a jerk, if he wasn't taking good pictures, Louis wouldn't have let him, or Louis, I guess, you know, get
Louis
that
loved
close.
him.
And you know, that's really close, and the eye contact is just wonderful. And
Daddy always pointed out that's
a
saliva
little
dripping out.
saliva coming down is a little kind of unusual touch.
Hey, Mr. Gottlieb.
And this, by the way, yeah, fire away.
Are you taking a Q&A during the presentation?
Yeah, sure.
As the images come up or something?
Yeah, keep in mind, I'm not the authority on these
No,
things,
I
so
understand.
fire away.
Yeah,
See what I can do.
at the end of this slideshow, we'll open it up for Q&A.
Oh, okay.
To review while...
Or if you have specific questions
Yeah.
about these, go ahead.
To refer to the previous shot,
Yeah.
does it seem to have a bit more appeal to it because of the vintage and the aging of the photo?
You know, there's always an element of that. I mean, to me, I feel that even if the color was better, with all those old cars and, you know, Errol Garner and Oscar Pettiford, and, you know, I mean, you know, those names have emotional resonance to those of us who, you know, who enjoy the music. But without the wet pavement, it wouldn't have had that kind of power. And by the way, this is a case of the hair light. Imagine if there was no second flash on the hair, you would have lost him against the background. Another case of getting in really close. Cameras he used did not have telephoto lenses. So, you know, now we can see a picture like this, you know, when it's somebody in row, you know, 97 with a 400 millimeter lens and a monopod shooting it. Well, no, he's like practically up on the stage with Billie Holiday. Now, sometimes he couldn't get in close, or for whatever reason, he was going for the whole, you know, the whole deal. But he had I think, the good judgment to crop in. And remember, you're dealing with, in a lot of these cases, roughly a 3 by 4 inch negative. And although the film was not as light sensitive as film nowadays, it wasn't super, super grainy film. So you could crop in like that and still blow it up very large. So I love the fact that when he would take a shot like this, he would find the emotional core of it and zoom right in. This gets me because of a lot of reasons, but the one that you probably wouldn't be thinking about is the kind of baldish head in the front. What that does to me when I see this is it says, we're in kind of a nightclub environment. And it didn't bother him that you've kind of got that feel. And the other thing is, it kind of pushes the attention up to the faces. So I just think this is a great composition. And Gillespie, according to Dad, could see that what he was doing, and my dad was like, you know, kind of over a little, you know, getting the picture.
Dizzy was cute all the time.
So he was always hamming it up, and so that's really him. Yeah.
But
And that was
Ray Brown.
Right.
Ella's husband in the back of that, Ray Brown.
The bass player.
Yeah, they were married at that time.
When I teach workshops, I tell people that the single most important tool you have other than your photographic equipment is a ladder to change the normal perspective. So I said, I'm always telling students, get up on a ladder, get down on the ground. Aren't you bored with looking at life from the same damn eye height that you've had since you were like 17 years old? And it's really hard to get people to do it because we're just so accustomed to looking at this, at the world from our standing height. And so I love the fact that he would get down on a lot of his pictures and do things dramatic. This is Sidney Bechet here. And this has got to be standing on the piano or something. I mean, I don't know quite how the heck he did this.
That shot was taken in, that was before the 40s, I'm sorry. It was in the 30s.
I wasn't guessing as to years. I'm just
No,
trying to figure
because
out how he
I know
got up
he
on the
has
piano.
certain dates on pictures in general, because it was hard to remember. But we heard Nat King Cole and his trio, and he was not singing. It was a trio. It was playing upstairs in a nightclub in Washington. I remember the stairs had, you know, when they wear down in the middle, people going up and down, and it was called The Golden Slipper or something like that. And he wasn't singing. It was the trio that was booked in there. And one of the guys, I don't know who it was, maybe because Nat played the piano, but there was one song that they played, and I remember asking him, why don't you sing that? And then he started singing, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. Yeah, now when these prints are made, this is a scan from the original negative. You know, my dad would certainly tone down the chair legs and the woman's leg or whatever that is in the background. This is, one of a handful of truly iconic images. And, we always remember people, I think, from the still imagery we have of them as opposed to a moving picture. And so this is one of those, captures that intensity of Parker. Now, we talked about lighting. If you use on-camera flash, like with the speed graphic, the flash is actually hooked onto the side of the camera, and you can release it and move it. And if you're going to move it farther than this, first of all, it's really hard to hold the camera. But if you move it here,
I'm holding it there.
if you want to move it farther than 3 feet, you need a light stand or a wife to do
You
it.
need both.
And but you can't, because the shutter is with the right finger. You can't put the flash on the other side. So then you really need the wife. And so if this were on camera flash, all of this would have been evenly lit. But you can see the flash is well off to the right. And just with the one flash, it's very effective, and it picks up the ear. So it gives, I don't know if you get tired of looking at those on-camera flash pictures where they look really flat, you know, there's no texture, they're boring, et cetera, et cetera. You never see that with him. And here he's moved the flash way off to the right because there's no light on the piano. So he moved it around and up. So now imagine trying to take a shot like this, which is impeccably composed, with not only the piano but some of these wavy, you know, background lines. It's just unbelievably like perfect, and the hand is in the perfect position. So if I were trying to get something like this as a photographer today, you know, I'd shoot 100 images. I remember the first magazine cover I did. It was of 2 United States senators, and I was so nervous, and I must have shot 100 shots, and then Senator Robert Byrd from Virginia, he looked down at me. No, it was Russell Long from Virginia. He looked down, you know, and I'm like cranking it through with the motor winder, just bam, 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 bam. He said, "Don't you think that's enough, young man?" I was like, "Okay, Senator, I really appreciate your patience. I think out of the 130 I got, I'm sure we got something."
A wonderful shot.
Yeah, yeah. So doing this with like 2 or 3 pictures, it's just, it just completely blows me away.
That's the one that he always tells the story about in a way.
Well, that's all along when he just rediscovered Thelonious Monk.
Thelonious.
Right, the original. Now my dad did several pictures that some people might call gimmicky. He uses some kind of a gimmicky or technique that's independent of the photo technique. Every time he did it, and I look at those pictures, I think the purpose was so well thought out and as well as beautifully executed. So Mel Torme, you know, a great singer with a long career, was known early in his career as the Velvet Fog. So my dad gets a little dry ice, he puts it in a
Mel
sink.
was in the shower, and he went out and bought dry ice. I don't know where the hell he got that quickly. He came back and put it in the sink.
Yeah, and then
ran
you add a little water and, you know, boom! You know, you get the fog.
And he had just come out of the come out of a shower.
And so it's, you know, it's just like perfect to illustrate an article about the Velvet Fog. And knowing how precise and kind of determined my dad was, it wouldn't surprise me if Mel had come out in a dark suit. My dad would have said, "Now, too dark. You got anything lighter?" Because that works. You know, it doesn't distract from the face. And who knows what that background is? You know, it's a little wrinkled fabric. You know, he might have just stuck it up on a pole and, you know, to create a background. I think that was shot in the mirror of the bathroom with the ice. I think he said the ice is in the sink.
It was in the sink.
So here's the mirror, and my dad is actually shooting the thing through the fog into the mirror. Pretty clever stuff. This is another one of those kind of kinky, gimmicky things. Stan Kenton had this kind of shattering style of music, and so my dad broke a mirror, and then photographed him and his whatever it is, trombonist. I kind of thinking. Or trumpet player, excuse me. Trumpet player, yeah. Photographing into a mirror. It's extremely clever. And this is another iconic picture of Duke Ellington, also taken in a mirror. So you're looking at Duke in the mirror, but this is in the foreground. So if it were sharper, you would see the words baby powder. And so when you're lighting this, you got to think of everything kind of in reverse, you know, because the lit area is not the area that's like closest to you. So, and he was very enamored actually of this particular picture, and so he started doing a lot of other people in mirrors, all pretty strong, but this was the best.
You know, he wanted to show Ellington.
Yes, the suits in the closet and so on.
Ellington that was a Countess Mara tie hanging there. Ellington had like 100 ties and 20 suits in his dressing room, and Daddy was just absolutely enthralled at the whole set
Right.
up.
As my dad used to say, you know, when Ellington gets out of the shower, he's kind of a fat slob like me. But man, when that guy puts a suit on, wow! And yeah, and so what Dad did was he was back in the same dressing room for another performance, but it was, if I'm not mistaken, Glenn Gray, who was another band leader, kind of more of a second-tier guy, and there was like one suit and one shirt in that closet. So it was a nice contrast. This is yet another bit of imaginative lighting, down low and to the left. And this is what we photographers refer to as ghoul lighting, when you get somebody from underneath and it gives them that spooky look. And Leadbelly was famous for having been in prison for, I believe, killing someone. So it gave my dad the idea to give it this kind of ghoul lighting. Not that, you know, I don't think it was like a malicious murder or anything, but there you are. And it's a pretty dramatic picture. The only guy I remember my dad would say awful things about, which is consistent with everybody else's opinion of Benny Goodman, that he was one real SOB. Yeah, even though he looks more like my father than any other person I have ever seen. And the other guy that looks like him is Steve Allen, who played Benny Goodman in the Benny Goodman story. The three of them could look like brothers standing together. So notice where he lit it, it actually just cast a shadow onto Goodman, which is kind of very unusual approach for how you would do it. And the other thing is, I think he deliberately did this rather than getting him more animated in a performance, because he didn't like him, you know, and he wanted to show this is a serious guy, and you know, and this is the picture he ran big in the book. There were a couple of others that I think he ran, but there was no picture where you felt the talent or the energy, because the guy was a brilliant musician. So this is how he ended up doing that. Another case of a hair light also falling onto the shoulder. And again, look at how he's getting just that right moment. Again, I would have done this probably the same way, except I would have done it with 100 shots to get just that right, you know.
That was taken at Liederkrantz Hall. So Liederkrantz Hall was supposed to have such wonderful acoustics. And we got there at 10 o'clock at night. And we were there until 3 o'clock in the morning, because Sinatra kept making the guys play things over and over and over again. And you can see he, not only had his collar open, I mean, he was tired. We were all tired. And when it was all over, Daddy went down to the musicians, because he knew a couple of the guys that were there. It was a pickup band there. And he said, were all those takes really necessary? The guy said, guy has perfect pitch, yes.
Yeah. Perfect pitch and a perfect photo.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the photo we were talking about with the wine glass and the pork and beans, and just one light. And notice how his right eye gets, this is called Rembrandt lighting, by the way, because it's using artificial light to create the lighting that Rembrandt so commonly used. And this is my favorite of all the pictures he's taken. It just has so much soul. And I just think it's absolutely perfection. So that's it on the jazz photos, and I'm going to show you a couple of others, just because, hey, I'm fond of it and I got a captive audience, you know. So this is...
Guess who?
I know you're looking and you're thinking, whoa, lost a lot of cuteness somewhere in there. Yeah, so this is how I spent a huge amount of my childhood.
Posing.
If you say, what are like the great memories, the most consistently great memory I have, and I don't think I ever told my mom this, is when I would be sitting in my class, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, whatever it was, and there's that movement that you see outside the class door in the window, and I'd see her face, and I'd go, I'm out of here. I am out of here. Dad needs me. And she would pull me out of class on a fairly regular basis. And because I was in all these books and film strips and so on, and I always had fun, because, he would say smile or pout or whatever, and I'm not much of an actor, but I got kind of into the rhythm. So he did a lot of children's books, and I got to be in And that one, and this one, and a bunch of others. That's our dog. But my favorite photo I'm saving for the end here, which is when he switched from jazz and started doing children's books and these things we called film strips, or that are called film strips. Early on, when I was, I'm thinking 7 or 8 years old, we did a film strip on the theme of a little kid who's angry with his parents and he wishes they would just go away. But then he realizes that, like, who's around to clean up after him, like wash the dishes, and so my dad did that. So that is for sure the favorite picture that's ever been taken of me, of the many that he took.
You were only about
pardon me?
I think you're about 6 years old then.
Okay, could be 6. And then I was honored, actually. You know, I said we didn't talk much about photography, but after he became kind of famous, he called me up one day and he said, you know, the next time you're out at the house, would you do me a favor, take my picture, because all these press guys come in and I don't know, it's not quite doing it for me. Give it some thought, take a little time, do me a good picture, would you? So this is what I did, and
Loved it.
and yeah, I think he liked it. He didn't like smiling much for the camera, but I got him in a, you know, in quite kind of the right spirit. And being a thoughtful photographer, knowing how many different ways pictures can be used, you see you can crop this like this, and it's just him. You can do a square, you can do a vertical, you can do a horizontal, and that's the way photographers think now, have to think. So anyway, there's one other thing I don't want to forget. A lot of you probably still remember Felix Grant. Now, my dad was not one to sing the praises of, you know, the people who interviewed him or who had contact with him, but I remember when he came home right after he did the Felix Grant interview, which I think was '79, and he was staying in my house when I was living in Chevy Chase. And I remember him sitting down, he said, "That guy knows his stuff. Man, he had that thing worked out, start to finish. He knew what questions to ask. He played the greatest music. It was a really great interview." And I had never heard him say that before about any other interview. And that's what we're here by virtue of the Felix Grant archive, so I end on that Felix Grant note.
So maybe this is an appropriate time if anybody has more questions or any questions. Steve would be happy to try to answer them. Yes, sir.
A couple of them, actually. Jazz comes from, in part, you know, the oral tradition, and you mentioned.
I'm sorry, the what tradition?
Jazz comes in part from the oral tradition, and you mentioned Ahmed Erdogan a bit ago, who did a fantastic interview that's available archived on Charlie Rose's website. Was there much, by the way, of an oral record that your dad left? Any interviews that?
Well, tons actually. And, you know, you have a bunch of them.
There's some on the website, on the Library of Congress website. You can hear him talking about his own photographs.
And I'll add one thing to that. I went to a bunch of his talks, and he has some truly great stories. There's some that are funny, there's some that are poignant, there's some that are just plain fascinating, and most of those stories are written down in his book.
The Golden Age of Jazz.
And they're not only great stories, but he really was a first-rate writer, absolutely first-rate. So.
Well, no, of his writing, but I meant more specifically, you know, audio recordings of his interviews.
Yeah, so that would be on the website. Other than that, I wouldn't know. Yeah.
The other thing is I guess his approach. You mentioned Rembrandt and Gould lighting. How much was he influenced by motion picture directors of his era, both like, you know, King, Fido, and Carol Reed, maybe even Orson Welles, you know, those kind of things?
Yeah. Well, we never ever had a conversation about you know, the classic movies or cinematographers. When I talk movies, I talk to her. She's the maven on old movies. So when I see a great old movie now, like, hey, Mom, have you seen, you know, and, oh yeah, I remember that from 40, well, as you see, you know, she remembers everything. If you'd given her time, you know, the people at Landsberg's and so on that she worked with, she would have told you about their personal life, their kids, their divorces. I don't know how, but it's all in there.
Were you, my last, were you joshing about the setup for this photo? Because that really is evil genius in a way that you could break up that photo into?
Oh, no, totally deliberate. You know, I had to rise to the standards of the old man as best I could. Yeah.
Who else has a question? Bertram.
I was wondering, at some point, I missed in the chronology, at some point you moved to New York permanently from DC. When was that in all
After
that?
the war. We lived in Washington from 1939 until I was still working in 1943 in Washington when you were born, because I had to finish my contract. She was born in October, and I left Barbara. He was in the Army someplace. I left Barbara at my mother's with a nurse, and I commuted back and forth, because as I said, they sent me up to New York every
Right, that's what I was
couple of
wondering.
weeks.
Right.
And I knew I had to work until the end of January to get my bonus. So.
Yeah, but
it
what's
was
really
all-
significant-
All because of money, but, you know, weekends I came down, I was there, and then every 2 weeks, I was up for 3 or 4 days during the week. So that's how she spent her first baby months.
What to me is interesting about that you know, that kind of the jazz time frame, it looks like 10 years, because you'll see pictures that are, you know, 39, and you'll see pictures that are 48, and you go, well, I can do the math. He was shooting for 10 years. Well, except he had 3 years in the Army. Sometimes he had full-time job, you know, in the government. He was teaching college at the University of Maryland, and on and on. So it was like, as a part-time thing, he was writing about jazz, and as a sub-part-time thing, he was taking these 1,600 photos.
I gave the University of Maryland, since we sold the house, you know, I was going through some of the files, and as Stephen said, he filed, everything was very, very well organized. But there were pictures from the University of Maryland that he took in 1941 or 2. They had ROTC there. He took pictures of me on the campus, and took pictures of, you know, the kids and the buildings and everything. And there were about 40 negatives. And I did a little bit of research to find the right person to call at the university. Well, I have gotten 3 letters that are absolutely, thank you very, very much. It fills in a place where we didn't have any record, and, you know, so forth.
So anyway, instead of shooting, this body of work was not done really over 10 years. It was more like done over 5 or 6 years, and those 5 or 6 years frequently,
And it was part-time.
he had other work.
Right, right.
So that's why, among other reasons, I look and I go, how'd he do it? You know,
Yeah.
it's like, whoa.
I often wonder, because it was really very, you know, very
Yeah.
part-time.
Yeah.
We were officially in New York from 44, I guess.
No, 46 was when I bought the house.
So he came back from the Army, and then you decided we're moving to New York because...
No, when he got out of the Army, he had decided he was going to work for he was going to go for Danby.
Oh,
But I had my father and my half-brother and half-sister. And so we needed a house, because we bought the house together because of what happened, and that was 1946.
Right.
so it was the
Because I was
downbeat...
pregnant with Stephen, that's how I know.
I know, I thought you were in New York a little bit before then.
No, we were not.
It was the
No, we were
downbeat
not.
job that ultimately made you
It was the
want to...
Army, we were in New Jersey, because he was at Fort Monmouth being separated. And that's where we lived for 6, 8 months, something like that.
You
No,
know,
the Army time, we were in a lot of different places.
having watched my dad give talks with his work a number of times, the single question that was asked by an audience member that is most memorable to me is, there some guy in the back of the room, and he says, Bill, did you really know Jelly Roll Morton? As if, you know, it had that aura of, so you met Ulysses Grant? When was that, you know? And my dad said, yeah, and the guy said, come on, really? So there is something about being the son of, you know, somebody who knew Jelly Roll Morton.
That's right.
And you feel like you're only one step removed from, whoa, this long history of people who matter, you know, if you listen to the music and like the music.
Well,
it's-
Jelly Roll's manager lived right near where we were. Can't even remember where it was.
She forgets an address from 70 years ago. She's going to be thinking about it tonight. She won't be able to go to sleep. What block was that? Damn. It was between.
So you knew him too.
Mom?
You knew him too.
Oh, yeah. I know all the musicians I know. I mean, there's a picture in the book that I took when Duke came to dinner with a lady friend and Ahmed Nesli. And
I thought you had jam sessions at the embassy.
we did.
At the Turkish embassy, a lot of the musicians
A lot
would
of
come
jam
there.
sessions there.
So
Tell us
of all the musicians that are captured and documented by your husband, which one did you feel closest with?
Which ones did I like?
Musicians.
Yeah, which musician did you feel closest with?
Oh. That's a hard question. Because I really liked Ellington a lot. But I was crazy about Nat King Cole.
I know.
And he was
He
really,
liked him.
and he really liked us, you know. I saw him, he came up to the Downbeat office a lot when Bill was working on Downbeat. And we had lunch, we had dinner with him.
I thought you put him on the radio, one of the first people to put him on the radio.
Oh, that's right, he did, when he started to sing.
He had a radio,
Yeah.
he had a couple of radio
Bill
shows.
had two different radio shows here, you know that.
On WRC
And
radio and
WINS.
WINX.
I remember WINS and Parkway Motors, they sponsored it.
Uh-huh.
And they did the commercials, yeah. And he would interview whoever came into town. But
Is there still tape of that,
Our
those interviews?
relationship with Nat went after the war too. And, anyhow.
Well, I think, is there one last question? Oh, maybe two more, yes.
I don't have a question, but I'd just like to say that I've often admired the lucidity and the artistry of some of the pictures that I've seen tonight, the photographs that I've seen. And I never would have thought that I would have met the family of the photographer of these. And so I'm in awe of it and very, certainly like to thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.
And to Ms. Corey for bringing it to us.
Yes.
It was great for the family to come. I mean, we get together somewhat regularly, but now, I mean, there's 4 Gottliebs here. Like, whoa, that's a quorum. That's a quorum. This is good. I'm glad we
I'll
did
show you a
this.
picture of my family. We have 20 in our immediate family.
Oh, my.
And,
Love to see it.
yeah, and they're all, how do I put it all the time? Just that they're all healthy and functioning.
I see.
And I think that's a gift from God.
We all brush our teeth and avoid between meal treats, and it's a good group.
One, Stephen used to show us pictures when we were all together that he was taking for a book. And I'll never forget one night, we're sitting in his house in Washington, and he's showing these different slides of things. And he showed a slide, and it was like a desert, and there was a sign that said, Zizek, something like that. And Bill said, oh, leave it right there, Steve. He said, were you standing at such and such a place?
It's in the California desert. We both took the exact same picture.
Bill had taken the exact same picture from standing from they both had figured out where was the best place to get this bloody sign. I'll never forget that as long as I live. They stood this exact place.
Lesson well learned.
And you had a question?
Yeah, a quick one. I remember you mentioning earlier that your father taught you at 12 how to use the darkroom. And I
He
was
did.
wondering why he did that and why he never explained more about photography to you. It seems just strange that he would show you how to use the darkroom but never talk to you about any other techniques of photography.
Yeah. Good point.
So it's just
Too late for me to ask him why that all was, but it was. We did have one lesson when I changed from kind of being a lawyer, and I'm honored that one of my bosses here is here from the old law firm. That's kind of the residue of my legal life. It's about there. That's about it. Filling that one seat I decided to become a photographer, and I saved some time when the family was taking kind of a long walk in Rock Creek Park to talk to him, to tell him I was going to change careers. And the sum total of that, like, 47-second conversation was, what are you, completely crazy? And I said, no, you know, I kind of love this, and I'm going to give it a go. And then we never talked anything about technique, except one day, early in my career, I had a commercial job. It was like a corporate location where I had to light some gigantic room. And I called him up. I said, Dad, I am like in serious trouble. I don't want to turn this assignment down. I really need the money. I need the experience. How the heck am I going to light a room that's, you know, like 500 feet by 2,000 feet long? And he said, okay, yeah, come over to the house. I'll show you and I'll let you borrow some lights. And so we had like a 4-hour, how do these lights work? How do you handle a situation like that? And the guy, he wasn't real good about, you know, teaching me, but when you asked him a question, and I've seen, you know, whether I asked him or anybody else, he was just incredibly lucid. He's a bright boy, you know, and he really knew how to explain things, which is why he went into children's books and, you know, wrote science books. It was one of his great talents. You know. But yeah, I wish I could ask him. There, you know, they go and then you want to ask them those like 6 key questions, like how come? But
it's worth noting that great musicians rarely teach their own children. They will send their children to somebody else for instruction. This happens over and over again.
And you have to tell them about how after the book was published, our youngest son was working in Kansas City, and he had a job driving a truck for an outfit that was a trucker, but they had decided that they were going to specialize in, they realized that there was a shortage of material for exhibit in small places, in libraries, in small colleges, and that there was a need. And so they developed a catalog of, they were out in the they had somebody had Thomas Hart Benton's, and they said they could use that, you know, and a half a dozen different things. And my son Edward brought the jazz book to this outfit called Smith Kramer, and he said, I think this would make a good traveling show. And they looked at it and they said yes. And they built crates, and they framed, they selected the pictures, they framed them. And the last 10 years of his life, he had a wonderful time going. They booked the shows in advance, you know, and they kept them up to 6 weeks all over the country. And he always said that I don't want to be put up in a hotel. I'd like to stay with somebody involved in this college or gallery or whatever. And so he got to meet people all over, always took some pictures of them in their house, which they adored, and had a wonderful time. Had a wonderful time. They would always have an opening with some music, and he'd have, you know, and do a slideshow, and he'd talk about the different musicians and what happened when he was doing. And now they have, how many books, how many of those, and he kept a record of everything, see? Everybody, all the publicity, they would send him the things that were in the local papers and so forth.
Yes,
and he was busy keeping those and having a good time.
His book was called The Golden Age of Jazz, and we commonly within the family referred to 79 and onward as the Golden Age of Bill. It really was his best years.
Because he had the best time doing that, you know.
All over the world. I mean, he went all over with the show.
Yeah, we went to Sweden. We went to Japan, and let me tell you, the show in Japan was something else. And they charge admission, and the galleries are in the department store. I mean, it took a little thinking about that. But there it was, and it was really amazing.
That book is currently out of print. And I wonder,
after 12 printings.
Yes. Are there any plans to reprint?
I have people working on it.
Okay.
To try to get Jazz at Lincoln Center, because I thought they would be the perfect place. And
But
if
nobody
not-
has any money
if I-
and, you know,
if-
and
if I
nobody's
don't
buying
make
books
any
anymore.
headline, I think that the Smithsonian
Tough.
or somebody should republish it,
Yeah.
because
Maybe the Library of Congress.
maybe the Library of Congress.
It's a shame.
Yeah.
It is a
It's a
shame,
shame it's that
because,
way.
it's a textbok. You
Yes.
know, it's used as a textbook. There are so many colleges now where they're teaching music.
Yes.
I mean, Lionel Hampton's stuff is in Moscow, Idaho. Everybody, in places all over the country where musicians, you know, are leaving their things where they have some relationship to the place.
So let me close by asking a final question. Why is the Gottlieb collection now public domain? I mean, we're grateful for that, but you explain to us.
Because when Dr. Billington, Dr. Billington said, well, I think we should have a period of time.
Yeah, but most people don't ever,
Correct.
at least for the life of the musician, the wife, the children, they withhold rights so they can continue to earn income.
That's right.
And I'm
Well,
not an authority
I
on
think
this,
that was
but
one of the things that, no, Dr. Billington wanted that.
but I think the library facilitated my dad getting a grant through the Ira Gershwin Fund, and my sense was he felt that was a good
Yes, they
a
did.
good compensation, and he had made quite a bit of money off the pictures through that time, and continued over those years, and I think it was like enough, and the public
That's
should
right.
have it.
So then let me offer some thanks here. First of all, thanks to Bill Gottlieb for his great work, his genius, his vision, his insight, his talent. There are reasons why his photos are among the most widely reproduced jazz images, and we've explored some of those reasons tonight. I also want to thank the Gottlieb family for not only being with us here tonight, but for your generosity as well in trying to help make these images accessible to the world. It's really a great gift for all of us. I would also like to thank Mike Fitzgerald and Judy Corey here at UDC. And lastly, let me thank you all for coming. And thanks to anybody who's going to look at this videotape in the future. Keep looking at these images. These photographs will inspire you. Thank you all for coming.
If you are interested in a tour of the Felix C. Grant Jazz Archives, you can meet with Rachel Elwell outside in the lobby. Thank you for coming.